O'Neill? That is your name, isn't it? Thank you for your kind remarks. Joey and Jan introduced me to Laura in their backyard. 4 months later, we were married. It's the best decision I ever made in my life. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Jan Bullock, the honorary chair of this event. Julie Oles and Molly Sherman, the gala co-chairman of this event. I thank Bill Jones for his kind remarks. I'm glad I called you into the office that day. Texas is better off for it. I want to thank all the elected officials who are here. I thank Clay Walker, George Walker Bush here, cousin. I thank my friend Karen Hughes for introducing Laura. One thing she didn't say was that Laura was always giving me good advice. As governor, what are you laughing at? So, like, she gave me some good advice this morning. I pulled out my tux. She said, "You're not going to wear that tux, are you? That's the tux you had when you were governor. People will know it. You need to go buy a new one." I looked her in the eye and said, "Read my lips, no new tuxes." Laura's a great first lady. I tell you, I am lucky that she was by my side during what was a fabulous time in Austin and a great time in Washington, D.C. I one time stood up in front of a big crowd and said, "Laura Bush was the greatest first lady our country has ever had." And there was huge applause. And then I realized my mother was sitting there. So I said, "Would you settle for a tie?" We are glad to be home. The adjustment from being president to citizen has been interesting. Frankly, it wasn't all that easy to go from 100 miles an hour to 0. I really learned I was no longer the president one morning when I was walking Barney the dog. I don't know if you remember Barney. Clay Johnson remembers Barney. Bartlett remembers Barney. These are two people that really didn't like Barney. I was trying to run into some of our neighbors who had been inconvenienced because our address had been put on Dallas TV. 650 people came to see where we were living in one day. We live on a cul-de-sac. I leashed up Barney and out we go. What was interesting is I hadn't walked in a neighborhood in 8 years. It's amazing how the simple things in life that you have not had become meaningful, and it was meaningful to be walking Barney. Barney had never walked in a neighborhood. He only knew the south lawn of the White House, Camp David, or Crawford. He spotted Dr. Young's yard. And there I was, 2 weeks out of the presidency, with a plastic bag on my hand. Picking up that which I had been dodging for 8 solid years. I learned a lot about life in public service. I learned that faith is important, your family is important, and so are your friends. When I think about my friends during my time as governor, I've got to think about Bullock and Laney. The person who was setting this deal up said, "Would you mind telling some Bullock stories?" I said, "Is the audience going to be mixed?" I will tell you a Bullock story. Bullock was on his deathbed, and I had just come in from campaigning in Iowa and New Hampshire. And my picture happened to be on one of these glossy magazines that nobody reads anymore. And Bullock slips off his mask, and I came to see him, and he slips off his mask. Jan was in with us, and he asked me to eulogize at his funeral. It's a huge honor. I said, absolutely, hang in there. And then he picks up the glossy magazine and he says, how come you didn't smile? It's the last word I heard from Bullock. I loved Bullock. He was one of the great men I have ever met in my life. One of the most memorable moments here in Austin came when Pete Laney introduced me as the new president-elect in the House of Representatives. You might remember that election. I won it 5 different times. And Laney graciously introduced me to the country. It's a gesture of kindness I will always remember. And Laura and I consider Nelda and Pete dear friends, and we thank you for being here tonight. Joe was right. We were blessed to have friends from when we grew up. I always thought it was good to have friends before politics, because they'll tend to be your friends during politics, and turns out to be your friends after politics. And we would invite them to Washington. And I would love to see these pals of mine in Midland come by the Oval Office, the shrine to democracy, the place where I spent a lot of time. And they would walk in, and you could just see them saying to themselves, gosh, I can't believe I'm here. And then they would look at me. But our friends sustained us. I am so grateful that you all have come tonight. I look around the room and see pals of mine that served in the governor's office and then made the huge sacrifice to go up to Washington, D.C. to serve the country. I believe the United States benefited from your service, and I know I benefited greatly from your friendship, and I want to thank you for being here. I also thank you all for supporting this museum. I love Texas, and I love the history of Texas, and I love the stories of Texas. And this museum does a fine job of telling all 3. I think about Sam Houston. I went to Sam Houston Elementary School, Midland, Texas. I think we probably have some other Sam Houston products here. He was my predecessor as governor. He was the President of the Republic. He was a United States Senator. Both of us drank too much. I love the Houston story, the story of a man who worked hard to get Texas accepted into the Union and then was confronted with a tough choice. You see, in order to keep office after Texas voted to secede, Sam Houston had to agree to the secession. All elected officials had to agree to the secession. He was a Union man. He thought Texas ought to stay in the Union. And he refused to sign. On the way out of the governor's house, which Laura and I were honored to live in, people lined the streets and threw garbage on Texas's greatest hero. The interesting thing about the story of Houston, it should say to us all, in life, you do what you think is right, that you make a statement based upon principle. Sam Houston was a man of courage. And what I find interesting is that with the reach of time, when history is past, he's our greatest leader in our nation's history, in our state's history. Happy Independence Day to you. God bless you all.